And pleased to introduce Allie Martin-Schofield, who's the Associate Vice President for Campus Engagement and Dean of Students at Cleveland State University. I will own and share with you all that Allie and I had a great conversation last spring at the completion of the in-person meeting that was held here in Columbus regarding qualitative inquiry, and discussed where some things maybe weren't fully rounded out or presented on that day. And she shared some of the things that she could bring to the table, and I was very excited. I've worked with Allie many times before, so I know the quality of work she brings, and so I'm excited that she was willing to take this on to share with our institutions here in Ohio. So Allie, thank you again for being willing to provide that feedback, number one, and then also being willing to take this on and present not just today, but also next week on this important topic for our campuses here in Ohio. So thank you so much, and I will now be quiet and turn it over to you.
Awesome, Carrie, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all today. As Carrie mentioned, we have worked together in the past, and I participated in a really great in-person session that spent a lot of time delving into some identity pieces that is really important in doing research, but also thought folks may want to engage in a conversation of more how to do that research. So once we're recognizing our identities and those pieces that we bring, what are ways that we can then move forward and take those action steps, whether we're doing research or evaluation around our programs? I understand that several folks are joining us and do work around sexual misconduct or hazing prevention. I do touch on those topics and the ways to use research related specifically to those, but the great thing about research and evaluation is that it is applicable to any topic and functional area. But since I knew some of the folks joining today would have that specific interest, that is what I focused on. Here is a little information about me. I am in my final year, fingers crossed, of my PhD program, hoping to defend next fall. My PhD is in urban education policy, and the research that I'm conducting is a critical case study on steps higher education should take to affirm access for students with disabilities or for disabled students. So I am looking specifically at state institutions and access efforts and measures that we all can be taking to make our campuses a bit more accessible. My other academic background is listed on the slide, and as Carrie mentioned, this is being recorded, and y'all are welcome to have access to all of my slides and things like that if there are things that you want to revisit. Carrie also mentioned that I am currently serving as the Associate Vice President and Dean of Students at Cleveland State University. And so my role connects with and overarches with some of our topics today. So I oversee our counseling center, student wellness and prevention. I don't work directly in our Title IX office or Office of Institutional Equity, but I serve as a decision maker and do some of the trainings around that work, having previously served as a Title IX investigator for about 8 years. I oversee our student conduct area, community standards and advocacy, our CARE program or our behavior intervention teams, which may be at your institutions, Office of Disability and Testing Services, campus engagement. So a lot of different areas that I'm working with and have the privilege to do work daily. Basic needs access as well, our food pantry. So research is really important to the work that I'm doing, not only in my doctoral program, but also in my functional role as Dean of Students. And so I do bring that practitioner lens while I am, sort of call myself a qualitative research nerd. I am a practitioner, so my goals and my research focus really is connected to my practitioner role and wanting to serve students the best that I can in that capacity. I am new-ish to Cleveland. I worked at Case Western Reserve University prior to working at Cleveland State, but I'm originally from Houston and have moved around a bit in my career. So still getting used to our fall and winter. And then just some fun facts about me. You will be spending time with me this week and next week if you're registered for both sessions. So I'm a proud mom of 4, a big reading nerd as well as research nerd. So I try to read a book for pleasure as much as possible, and then love going to plays and spending time with my kids, and my giant dog, Brody, whose picture is in the bottom left-hand corner, my big golden doodle. So the outcomes for part 1 and 2, when Carrie and I were talking about this, in designing the content, we thought it would be about 3 hours, and we wanted to make it as accessible for folks as possible. So we're doing this virtual format, and we've divided it into 2 parts with the hopes that folks can attend both, because we really want to dig into some of the theory, but then also have some of that practical lens and practitioner based. So here are our outcomes, distinguished between different types of qualitative inquiry. So I'll look at these big 5. There are other types that we'll touch on briefly, but there's primarily 5 that we'll focus on. We'll look at philosophical assumptions and frameworks. We'll outline differences between inquiry and evaluation and understand which practice is best. Some of you may be wanting to do evaluation. Some of you may be wanting to do research, and there are different tenets connected to both. So we're going to go into both of those. Engage in writing qualitative inquiry questions, determining observation strategies, highlight areas of focus. If you're doing a sort of a case study look, looking at documents, looking at websites, if you're doing a narrative approach, how to review those interviews and do some coding, if those are pieces that you're wanting to get into. Practice basic data analysis. So again, some of those coding pieces, and we'll also look at some of the tools available that likely your institutions have memberships to, or there are student memberships available, or trial memberships, or free memberships, but we'll look at some of those data analysis tools. Recognize ways data supports our work in higher education, specific to these areas that we talked about: student wellness, sexual assault prevention, hazing prevention, and reflect on ways our own identities and positionalities intersect in that work, building off of that great in-person session that we had earlier. So some guiding questions that y'all are welcome to unmute yourselves or enter into the chat, but I'm interested. What assessments or evaluations are happening on your campuses or in your organizations? So what types of work is already happening? And y'all can unmute or enter into the chat to let me know some of those things that are already going on. Okay,
So
great.
we have a response of mostly surveys for various programs and events.
Great. And surveys can be really helpful, mostly surveys.
We have a student organization with PhD psych students that like to do qualitative analysis, usually related to climate questions.
Great. That's great. And there certainly are those larger climate surveys that institutions can contract and do, or take the guiding questions from ODHE and other organizations doing those climate work. Other things besides surveys or some climate related questions? So some post surveys, healthy mind surveys for faculty, staff, and students. Great. Surveys are great, absolutely. We've recently put together a fairly broad survey through our Student Experience Committee, where folks can scan a QR code and have access to this broad survey. So regardless of what initiative they're engaged with, whether it's a week of welcome event or donuts with the dean or something like that, they can use the same survey so we can gather some information. So surveys are great. What has previously been your role in assessment and evaluation? Are y'all the ones designing these surveys, just receiving the data? Kind of what has your role been in the past? That would be helpful for me to know. And you can enter into the chat or unmute however you feel most comfortable.
All right, so the role varies. Sometimes we are the audience that the survey results are provided to. Sometimes we are leading through IRB, receiving the data, and I have helped a colleague make some surveys after late night events that we do on our campus.
Great. Thank you all for folks sharing that information. And I think that tends to be true, dependent on your role on your campus, whether you're designing, creating, implementing, whether you're the audience, whether you're a stakeholder or a benchmark, doing the benchmarking, collecting and reviewing. Okay, great. So some various roles. And then have you seen positive or negative or unknown, meaning you're not sure or that hasn't been shared with you, outcomes from assessment and evaluation? How has that information generally been received for your institutions?
Would you have time to meet with the walk-ins?
I'm in a webinar at the moment.
Okay, all right, I'll ask them.
Because the nice thing with evaluation and assessment is that it can share positive or negative information based on what it shares and also based on what it doesn't say. So if you're asking questions around culture, for example, and folks just don't have a strong response to something, maybe they're not aware of it, maybe they don't know about a certain initiative or a student org or a prevention method that's happening. So you can find out some information based on what folks are saying, but also based on what folks aren't saying or aren't sharing about. We have a comment here. There's an opportunity that we have that is created around the buzz when an assessment is made to continue a conversation. And that can be really important too. Again, whether it's positive or negative feedback or both or somewhere in the middle, that buzz to continue the conversation, that maybe students gave specific data that's really important and can be addressed, and a lot of different offices can be involved. That can be really helpful. We get mixed reviews, some that take time and are really good, give good answers, and some that are worried that their answers will not be confidential, so do not want to answer. Absolutely. Confidentiality is a huge question, and we'll talk about that more next week around recruiting participants for our different assessments or evaluations. But certainly being able to promise that confidentiality or that privacy or that their information maybe will be shared in aggregate or collective format, not individualized, again, depending on the work that you're doing. And I guess the final question, if folks are comfortable answering, what are your expectations for today's session or for the pair of sessions? You're giving an hour and a half each day on, if you're in Cleveland, a very rainy, gray Monday. So what are you hoping to take from these sessions? Again, you're welcome to answer in the chat or to unmute. I know when Carrie and I were talking about this presentation idea, we were talking about some of those kind of nitty-gritty how-tos. So like, you have this information, but what do you do moving forward? What are some of the steps? We would love to see how we can integrate the information learned here into our hazing prevention efforts on campus. Great, so some direct correlation to some hazing prevention efforts. Great. And there may be some of those other pieces too, but we'll go ahead and jump into the content. I do have quite a bit of engagement pieces here because if we were meeting in person and if we were dividing into some small groups for some of this work, we would have some of these conversations. So again, Feel free to unmute or enter into the chat. In what ways does data support our work in higher education specific to student wellness, sexual assault prevention, and hazing prevention? So in what ways does data or can data support our work? Why is data important to some of these things that we're doing? And I have some suggestions as folks are considering and entering into the chat. So it could be around resource allocation, it could be around themes and trends, staffing, where are we able to put some energy into places, grant writing and other financial sources, time and effort, kind of a cost analysis, benchmarking, designing campaigns. In the chat we have, oh, please.
Oh, is this identifying populations that are being impacted disproportionately, capacity of resources, to know the capacity of resources, literature for sexual assault prevalence, and then also prevention goes back decades. So it helps us to ground our work as part of a long arc as opposed to a moment in time.
Absolutely. Absolutely, all of these reasons. Questions, are our initiatives having any impact or influence? Do our students understand their options? How many in our population may be affected by these situations? Are we actually being trauma informed? So these are broad, overarching questions that may be able to be answered through assessment and evaluation, and certainly all of the pieces that folks are entering into the chat. Disproportionately impacting populations. Resources, I think, is a big question on many of our minds, and certainly on ours here at CSU. And then helping us to ground our work. So thinking about identities and positionality in research, which is really important when you're doing qualitative research, which is primarily what I'll be talking about. Take a moment and reflect on ways your own identities and positionalities intersect in data work. And specifically consider, what are the identities that are most important to you, and how do those affect your research, or how could those affect your research? We'll just give folks a moment to kind of reflect on that question. And as folks are considering that, I wanted to provide an example in case that is helpful in how we're thinking about our identities in our research. So I, over the past year, conducted a pilot study for my dissertation. And in that pilot study, I was interviewing staff members who work at disability services offices around my specific research question around barriers for disabled students. I entered into that research as someone with a disability. I consider, I call myself a disabled researcher doing disabled research. I do use identity first language. So as a disabled researcher, I went into that research really thinking that this image on the left-hand side of the screen was what the results were going to be. And I kept trying to sort of fit these narratives and this case study research into this Venn diagram that, because of vague information from the ADA and 504, because institutional interpretations of obligations, because students with disabilities and advocacy and knowledge of process, all of that overlapping created barriers. And I kept trying to fit things into that model because that had been my experience. Reflecting, memoing, going back and really looking at the data, realized that I wasn't actually interpreting my participants the way I needed to. I was too focused on my own experience and not focused on what they were actually telling me, which relayed to this image on the right-hand side, that institutional interpretation, an unclear process, an advocate or lack of advocacy, documentation, kind of had these intersections with barriers in the middle related to all of those pieces. And so my example in thinking about my identity, if I'm doing disabled research on experiences with disabilities, I really have to situate the participants' experiences and not my own. So that's one way that our identities could influence or impact the work that we're doing. We may, or I was, too sort of caught up in my own experience to really take a moment to see what my participants were trying to tell me. And we could be so connected to an initiative that we have created, we could be so proud of some work that we're doing, that it may be hard for us to recognize what's not working, what population is not being influenced or impacted, what harm may be caused by some of the work that we're doing if we're not as trauma informed as we believe we are. So that's why taking that moment and really thinking about our identity, and that previous workshop that we've had around our identity is so important when we're doing research. Does anyone want to share any other thoughts or examples around the impact of identity in research? And if so, please unmute or enter into the chat.
So we have one comment about our salient identities may also impact the comfortability of the participants to share their candid experiences.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that comment. When we're recruiting our participants, we really have to keep that in mind. How we're phrasing or wording a survey, if we're doing focus groups, who are facilitating the focus groups? From what populations are we pulling participants? Are we making sure that we have representation and voices from across our campuses and our organizations? It's a really important point. We're going to briefly talk about research ethics. A lot of you, it sounds like, are engaging in some level of research work, but it is important to me to spend a little bit of time talking about this, so we will. The Institutional Review Board, or IRB, is going to be the deciding factor on your research. So regardless of what information I present or you receive in other sessions, your institution's IRB will be the deciding factor. If you're doing research on other institutions or in a collaborative, you may be working with multiple IRBs, or if you're working with other organizations. So just be mindful of that institutional review boards should be consulted for any of this work around human subjects. And also for any folks who are interested in additional reading, just included some books that go into some pretty horrible real life accounts of why the Institutional Review Board is so important, and areas where we have made pretty significant mistakes around that. So The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and looking at the HeLa cells that are still used today in cancer treatment. Bad Blood, looking at the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and then Typhoid Mary, looking at an Irish immigrant in New York who was labeled Typhoid Mary for being a asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. So some good additional reading if you're interested in some of those pieces and some pretty horrible things that have been done in the name of research. So there's some foundational documents for folks to be aware of. Again, I don't want to go into a lot of detail. I've included some links here, but it is important to know that these rules and regulations come from somewhere and come from some harm and mistakes that have been made. So the Declaration of Geneva was last amended in 2017 and includes a physician's pledge. The Nuremberg Code, after the Nuremberg trials and World War II and the Holocaust, outlines 10 points for conducting ethical research, including fruitful results for the good of society, avoiding mental and physical suffering, voluntary consent, all of these pieces that we may say, well, of course you have to have that in research. There were guidelines that had to be created in order for us to be able to say, of course, we want to have these things. The Declaration of Helsinki, which includes the binding statement for physicians, the health of my patient will be my first consideration, and the duty of physicians is to promote and safeguard health, well-being, and rights of patients. And then the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services 2018 requirements, also known as the Common Rule, requires that researchers provide the prospective subject with information that a reasonable person would want in order to make an informed decision. And there's also guidelines for how that information is shared with the participant, and that it has to be able to be understood, using common phrasing, cannot be intentionally confusing. And one of the most important pieces of documentation is the Belmont Report. So the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research released the Belmont Report in 1979, which basically calls for these three basic principles: respect for persons, justice, and beneficence, and ensuring that we are considering the participants or patients' experience and well-being in the research. So I've included a link here to the Belmont Report, but these are some foundational documents that are important guiding principles for our work. When you're looking at IRB, or informed consent, it has to include disclosing to potential research subjects information needed to make an informed decision, facilitating the understanding of what has been disclosed, and promoting the voluntariness of the decision about whether or not to participate. And so if you're looking at any of those books that I recommended, or any case studies where this maybe hasn't been done correctly, it comes down to those three areas. Is it really voluntary? Was someone coerced into participating? Did folks understand what they were signing onto and what they were committing to? And then what information do they need for a reasonable person to make an informed decision? And there are trainings that you can go through, likely through your institution or other organizations. The Collaborative Institutional Training Institute is one that folks can go through and have some pretty intensive IRB training prior to doing research. So keeping that in mind, and know that you have some programs in place to help with that learning. So what ethical considerations, if any, do you observe at your institution or organization when you're doing your research or your evaluation? What things are y'all thinking about on your campuses and your institutions around ethical considerations in research? And you can unmute or respond in the chat.
For us, one of the things that we always think about is the readiness of our audience to hear that information once it's shared. If they're unfamiliar or the information is shocking, then it means that we have to be more thoughtful about how we present the information.
I love that. I think that's a really important point, specifically if you're doing research or evaluation in an area that hasn't been broadly talked about before. So if you're sharing with your institution or organization information from a climate survey around sexual misconduct or sexual violence, and you've never had those broad conversations before, that can be pretty startling information. And also thinking about your audience. Institutions have a lot of conversation and reflection about which audiences can receive the full information. And if there are specific pieces that they want to share in different ways, whether it's through social norming or through program development or staff changes or staff creation, but often full reports with sensitive content may not be shared broadly with an entire institution, at least in one modality. So that's a really great point. How ready is the community to hear the information? Positive or negative, perhaps. Okay. So going into what is research? So I mentioned earlier that I am a practitioner, so I go into this research idea wanting to know how it's going to influence or impact my practice, how it's going to benefit students specifically. So practice refers to interventions that are designed to enhance the well-being of an individual. Involves behavioral practice to provide a diagnosis, preventative treatment, or therapy. Whereas research designates an activity designed to test a hypothesis, permit conclusions to be drawn, and thereby to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Usually described in a formal protocol, and activity should undergo review for the protection of human subjects. So research is looking at testing hypotheses, drawing conclusions, developing and contributing to generalized knowledge, implications for our work, implications for how we're spending our money, arranging budgets, implications for initiatives that we're doing, preventions that we're engaging in. And there's often some debate between quantitative and qualitative. You will always hear from me that both are equally valuable to our work, but specifically quantitative is often a set of strategies, techniques, and assumptions, gathers a range of numeric data, it's looking at numeric patterns, allows researchers to conduct simple to extremely sophisticated analyses. And a lot of those methodologies include questionnaires, structured observations, or experiments. Qualitative, which we'll be talking more about today, is often described as richly descriptive data. That's often the outcome. It begins with assumptions and the use of interpretive and theoretical frameworks, which we'll go into briefly today. Attempts to understand from participants' perspective, so it really situates in that participant's experience. The researcher is the primary instrument of data collection analysis, which is why it's so important for us to understand our own identities and our positionality and implications for that, because we are the primary instruments. Use an emerging qualitative approach, and we'll go into some of those. Collect data in a natural setting, meaning in day-to-day work, in an office, at an event, at a program, in the everyday goings-ons of a college setting. Data analysis is both inductive and deductive, and the analysis establishes patterns or themes, and the results are often richly descriptive. I mentioned earlier that truly both are best. I have a quote here that I really appreciate. Quantitative research generates factual, reliable outcome data that are usually generalizable to some larger populations, and qualitative research produces rich, detailed, and valid process data based on the participants rather than the investigators' perspectives and interpretations. There is so much value to both quantitative and qualitative, and often they're kind of pitted against each other, and that's not necessarily helpful to the work that we're doing. We can get really valuable, rich data from a quantitative assessment, and we can get really valuable, rich data from a qualitative assessment as well. And there's certainly the option for mixed methods. But I wanted to share kind of an example of a research project that I did. Being a qualitative researcher, I do tend to lean more qualitative, though I recognize the value of quantitative. But doing this research project really helped me recognize more of the values of the quantitative side. Recently, I did a standard linear multiple regression related to COVID. I was interested in seeing if there was any correlation between students' year in college, whether they were a new student or upper class student, whether they, how many times they had been referred to our care area, our care department, our behavior intervention, and whether or not they were referred to care because of COVID or not. And so did the standard linear multiple regression, really thinking that the analysis would show, well, yeah, students are more successful when they're referred to care. Learned that that wasn't the case, actually, that the more care referrals a student has, the less likely they were able to be retained at the institution. And looking at the data, that makes sense, right? If someone has 5 or more care reports, they may be experiencing some pretty significant challenges and barriers to their education. And so regardless of the referral and the support there, having higher number of care reports, higher number of situations they're being referred for, really had an impact on their ability to maintain and stay a student. So I was thinking this report would sort of just support what I thought, that students connected to care performed better and were retained more often. And that's not necessarily the case. And so that rich data really came from a numeric perspective. Whereas if I had interviewed students talking with them about their connections to care, again, I might have had a different perspective. So I mentioned that we would talk about philosophical assumptions. We won't spend a lot of time here because it gets really philosophical and folks may not be wanting to delve into that too much, but certainly in our Q&A, if folks want to talk more about that, we can. But the primary philosophical assumptions are ontology, the nature of reality, epistemology, how knowledge is known, axiology, the acknowledgement of values in research, and methodology. So I have some information there that you can refer back to. But it's just important to recognize when we're doing research specifically that our philosophical assumptions will influence the type of research that we're doing. So how we see reality, is it multiple? Is it steadfast and steady? Is there one reality? What counts as knowledge? Who can create that knowledge? Is research value laden or not? Are biases present? And then whether we're using inductive logic and emerging design. And then interpretive frameworks. So again, I'm picking the high level pieces. We'll look at 4 of the philosophical paradigms. We'll look at a few of the interpretive frameworks, and then we'll get more fully into our research that we're talking about. So post-positivism is looking at cause and effect, social constructivism, multiple meanings, social construction of that meaning. Transformative frameworks often are to aid and improve society. So if you're looking at discrit, critical disability theory, other things like that, pragmatism, what works? What is the outcome of the research? Really pragmatic. And all of those connect to our work in qualitative research. So our overarching questions in qualitative research is, how do people make sense of their world and their experience? And how do individuals and groups construct meaning from their experience? So those are our primary questions that qualitative research is looking at. How do people make sense of their world? And how do individuals and groups construct meaning? Types of qualitative research approaches, which we'll go into in a little bit: ethnographic research, narrative, phenomenological, case study, and grounded theory. There are others. These are the primary 5 that are most often the focus, but there are other types. And why would we want to maybe look at a qualitative approach over a quantitative approach? We want to add to any deficiencies in literature and add to any gaps, any new information. We want to give voice to underrepresented groups. We want to probe understanding of central phenomena. We want to lead to outcomes. We want to hear stories. We want to hear the essence of a phenomena. We want to generate theory, perhaps a theory around an experience that is not a working theory. We want to understand the cultural life of a group, or do an in-depth analysis of a case. The research that I'm doing, for example, is looking at some deficiencies in literature around higher education experiences of disabled students. There's much more research on K through 12 experiences and not higher ed experiences. There's also a lot of research on disabled experiences where the researchers have not actually spoken to someone with a disability. And so that's something that I'm really wanting to do, is to center the disabled voices and disabled experience in my research. So those are some of the reasons that I chose qualitative and why I'm looking at a critical case study. And here are those top 5, or primary 5. So an ethnography is the study of people in their environment, uncovering patterns. There's some really great studies around using ethnography around language. There's narrative, the accounts people tell to describe experiences, their stories, their firsthand accounts. Phenomenological is a study of an individual's lived experience and exact phenomena, and how that person experienced that phenomena at that time. And there's a lot of really good research available on sexual assault and hazing related or using a phenomenological approach. So folks are wanting to look at research studies, and as was mentioned before, there's assault prevention and prevalence literature that goes back decades. There's some really solid phenomenological reports that are really worth looking into. Case study is a specific case or situation used to identify key issues. So it's a specific bonded case that you're looking at. And then grounded theory, which is generating theory. I mentioned there's others, there's historical, there's action research, where the researcher is really right there with the participants and engaging together. So there are other approaches, but those are the top 5. I also want to spend some time talking about evaluation, because often when we're talking about research, what we're really looking at is evaluation. So we're looking at a systematic process to determine a program's merit, worth, or significance. We may be wanting to evaluate an initiative, a program, an approach, a training, and we're not necessarily wanting to do research on that, but we're wanting to evaluate it in some way. We want to determine its merit, its degree of excellence or quality, its worth, so its value in relationship to a specific need or purpose. Did that initiative address what we were needing it to? And then significance, the influence, importance, and visibility. I also wanted to recommend a really great step-by-step book, Program Evaluation, so that reference is there for you to use. And looking at inquiry versus evaluation, just to be really clear, so research is about creating knowledge. Methods depend on the discipline. It's very researcher-oriented and focused on scholarship, and it's looking at, among other things, validity, reliability, credibility, transferability. Is the information that we are learning through this research, is it transferable to other institutions or other settings? Evaluation is looking to determine quality. It's looking to determine the quality of an initiative, an event, a response. Methods are eclectic, and they may mimic research. I think that's where they get convoluted sometimes, because some of the methods for evaluation are really similar to the same methods that we use for research. It's stakeholder oriented, connected to outcomes and usefulness. And then it is looking at utility, feasibility, accuracy, and accountability. So that's how those two sort of compare and contrast. Any questions or clarifications before I move on? Feel free, as always, to unmute or type into the chat. Okay. So how about some examples of evaluation in our daily lives? Remembering that evaluation may be quick and informal, or it may be a more formal activity, maybe more structured. What are ways that we engage in evaluation in our daily life? What are things that we are evaluating? Feel free to unmute or type into the chat. And this can be work-related or connected to just outside of work, personal life evaluation.
I often feel like I evaluate how little sleep I can get and still be productive the next day at work. It's a lifelong experiment.
I'm sorry to hear that, but if we were in a room together, I really feel like you would get a lot of head nods of agreement or thumbs up. But yes, how much sleep do we need to be productive? How much coffee do we need based on how much sleep we need if we are coffee drinkers?
Also got, if we're hungry, hot, cold, etc. How did you like dinner? After answering questions on the phone, did that help with your question or concern?
Absolutely. Absolutely, that's great. We are doing evaluation all the time. So I provided just a few examples. What movie should we see? So we are evaluating. Are you seeing Barbie or Oppenheimer? That was a big evaluation folks maybe were making a few months ago. What type of car seats do I want to buy? What is the safest? What is the cheapest? What is the best quality? What will transition the best? What am I making for lunch? We really do evaluate things all the time, but there is some systemic ways for us to engage in evaluation in our specific work. So the main types of evaluation, and thank you all for sharing those examples: process evaluation, outcome evaluation, and cost analysis. So process evaluation is looking at a quality of program's content, products, or delivery. It looks at the context, who all is involved, the history, looks at the reach, how many folks were involved or connected, how broad, amount delivered. Was it one training? Was it 5 trainings? Was it delivered as planned? We are doing here at CSU a collection of mandatory hall meetings in our residential communities because we've had a significant uptick in violence and high-risk group meetings and students making threats and weapons. So we're doing some mandatory meetings, and there's 16 different meetings. And so it's a group of us who are presenting them. Part of a process evaluation would be, was the conversation that we are having in these 16 different meetings, is it delivered as planned? Are we following the scripted agenda? Are we engaging in that delivery of the service in the same consistent way? How is it received? How are we recruiting participants? So that's all part of process evaluation. Outcome evaluation measures changes in people or conditions affected by a program. So it looks at intended and unintended outcomes that may be individual, organizational, or community level, and has various terms of immediacy. So it could be short-term, long-term, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year kind of planning. And then cost analysis, looking at costs and benefits. Is this thing that we are offering worth the time, the energy, the resources, the people? What is the benefit that we are receiving? So those are the 3 main types of evaluation. And we have seen evaluations historically. So again, we do it in our daily life. We also have had some significant evaluations connected to education throughout history. So I wanted to make some reference to that. In the early 1900s, continued growth of evaluation in educational context. Post-World War II, studies looking at job training, housing, family planning. The Brown v. Board of Education decision came from Brown's evaluation of 93 schools, revealing disparities. Boykin also revealing disparities in financial resources and teacher salaries related to Black and white serving schools. The war on poverty planning came from evaluation. And then the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, looking at Penn State, Sesame Street, doing some evaluative pieces there. So we've seen it historically too. Thinking about programs to evaluate. Take a few moments and consider what programs you're offering, which may benefit from evaluation. So take a moment and jot down a few, or maybe you just already have them in your mind, and we'll discuss after just a moment. Okay. So what are some programs that you're offering that may benefit from evaluation? Separate it out a bit from research and assessment, but thinking about evaluation. What are some programs that may benefit from evaluation? And folks can unmute or answer in the chat. Any programs or initiatives that folks are working on around hazing prevention or sexual misconduct prevention that would fit for evaluation? For one of these types of evaluations, process, outcome, or cost analysis.
bystander intervention may need some evaluation, the program education that is.
Can you say more about that, Carrie?
I was reading a comment, so
Oh, thank you.
if the person's willing to unmute themselves and share more, that'd be awesome. Or if they're more comfortable, I will keep monitoring the chat and share the additional pieces.
I can share. My name's Brittany. So our main prevention education program that we do is called Bringing in the Bystander. And we are in our last year of a contract with this particular program. I'm new in my position, so kind of feeling it out what we have. And I don't know that it's really engaging this campus in the way that I feel is most effective. In the past, we had there was more attendance to it, but it was because it was required of Greek member organizations. But now we attend their new member orientation and present there. And we also present some of the stuff to a lot of the orientation courses for both undergrad, occasionally a grad. So we're getting into the classroom at places where students are required to be. So now they're not attending this program that we have open to other students because it's not presented in every classroom. Or you may have gotten it as a first year student and now you're in your third year and you really could use some some refresh or new information. So just kind of exploring what it looks like, but since students aren't really attending the outside of classroom ones, it's hard to evaluate attendees to say, hey, what did you like about this program? What did you not like about this program? So that's kind of a big area that I'm looking at now is what does our prevention education look like?
Great, thank you, Brittany. And as folks are thinking of other potential areas, certainly bystander intervention, a recommended best practice as part of our prevention planning around sexual misconduct, around hazing, around lots of different topics. Bystander intervention can be applied, including alcohol and other drug prevention, things like that. So other folks may be really interested in the program evaluation piece for bystander intervention too. And thinking about, are students satisfied with the delivery of the information? Is it having a change in folks' behavior? Thinking about pre and post tests before participating in bystander intervention, how likely were you to intervene? After participating in bringing in the bystander or green dot or altruistic or whatever the bystander intervention program may be, are you more likely to intervene? Are you more likely to recognize barriers to your intervention and still find ways to intervene, things like that? So developing a specific program evaluation could be really helpful for that. Thanks for sharing. Any other ones folks want to discuss? Okay. In both of these that we have talked about in research, inquiry, or in evaluation, it starts with a question. Doing more formalized research, you have a more formalized script as you're developing this question and this purpose and this goal. So it's looking at those frameworks and ideologies and putting together something like this. The purpose of this case study is to understand or describe the bystander intervention program for participants at Brittany's institution. At this stage in the research, the bystander intervention will be generally defined as, and then general definition of that concept, students who participate in the bystander intervention outside of class experience, something like that. And then what question are you developing from that formal script? So here's what we've described, and then we have several questions. Evaluation operates in a really similar way. What do you want to know? How do you want to gather that information? Who should be involved? What are the barriers to accessing what you want to know? Is the information sensitive or controlled? And what information are you starting with? So folks can take a few minutes and really think about some programs or initiatives at your college or institution, at your institution or organization. I'm not sure if we're all currently working at an institute of higher education or not. We may be working with some organizations adjacent to. But think about what your questions are related to your program, initiative that you're wanting to learn more about. Are you wanting to do research, or are you wanting to do evaluation? And it may be dependent upon these questions. So take a moment and say, what do you want to know? What are your questions? What is the impact of this program? Are students enjoying it? Are students gaining the information that we're wanting them to? Are they gaining skills? How do you want to gather information? Do you want to do a survey? Do you want to do a focus group? Do you want to observe? If you're looking at how often a space is used, we have a commuter lounge here at Cleveland State University that we're wondering how best to promote, but also trying to get an understanding of who is using it and how is it used. That may be an observation study. That may be, someone sitting in the commuter lounge and observing throughout the day who's coming and going. What activities are they engaging in the commuter lounge? Are they using the computers? Are they using the kitchenette? Are they taking a nap? Are they having a club or an organization meeting? Who should be involved? Who is the researcher? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the participants? Who are helping to craft the questions? What are the barriers to accessing what you want to know? Is it a more controlled environment? Do people walk out of the commuter lounge if there are people already in there? What are some of the barriers? Is the information sensitive or controlled? And certainly related to some of the topics we've talked about, could be very sensitive information. If you're asking about someone's experience working in a Title IX office, working with a student conduct office. What information are you already starting with? What pre-existing data do you have? Previous surveys of student culture, previous interviews, previous shared data. So take a few moments and really go through one specific thing you're wanting to investigate, and we'll circle back and talk about that in a moment. Okay. Hopefully folks have had a moment to go through these 6 questions. Is anyone comfortable sharing something that they're considering from an evaluation or research perspective? And we can kind of go through these 6 questions together. or if you didn't get a chance to go through the 6 questions, are there a list of a variety of things, and you're interested in this group's thoughts about which should maybe be evaluated or assessed or researched first?
I can share.
Thanks.
I would like to know if people are aware of how to report instances of Title IX situations.
Great. So are you wanting to know if the full campus knows how to report or students specifically?
Ideally, the whole campus.
Okay. So you want to know if the whole campus knows reporting methods for Title IX.
Mhm.
How do you think you want to gather that information?
I want to say surveys, but I also know survey fatigue is a potential barrier.
Sure.
And there's one person in our Title IX office, so going and doing individual questions or questions to groups may be another barrier.
Gotcha. Okay. We'll circle back to that because survey fatigue is really important and something that we go into a little bit next week. Who should be involved, do you think, in this, helping to answer this question?
Maybe I need a clarifier on that one. Is that the groups that we're trying to get information from, or in creating our method for solving this problem?
Yeah, I think it's all of those. So all of the folks that would need to be involved, kind of your stakeholders in this process. So you mentioned, I think you mentioned a one-person Title IX office, or maybe just one person who would be available to look at the data.
Yep, it's a one-person office.
One-person office. The respondents, so faculty, staff, and students. If leadership would need to review whatever the method is and review the questions. So any sort of stakeholders like that. Is the information sensitive or controlled?
No.
No, not really. If you're just looking at if they know the reporting process.
Correct.
And then what information are you starting with, if any?
I mean, potentially we could start with who's in what groups. We know who our employees are, we know who our students are. We also know the leadership in both those areas to hopefully give us an opportunity and a platform to raise these questions.
Absolutely. Some other information you may be starting with is who are already submitting reports to Title IX. Is it coming from primarily your Res Life staff? Is it coming primarily from your faculty? So that's information you may be able to know dependent on if it's captured in your case management system or something like that. In terms of how you want to gather the information, thinking about a survey, and again, something that we'll go into a little bit more detail next week, but surveys don't have to be super involved or take a long time. Folks have had a lot of success with sort of micro surveying, creating a QR code that students scan while they're standing in line to answer a quick survey about a program or event. Creating a one-person quick kind of micro survey might be able to get you this information and not put a lot of burden on your one-person office, potentially. If the question is, please select all of the ways someone can report a Title IX report, and folks can click off. Or if it's an open-ended, if you wanted to do that, that's a bit more work. If it's a qualitative response versus just checking boxes, but you could create some kind of micro survey in that way. If there are surveys that are already happening on your campus where you're allowed to add an additional question, that might be a way to do that. Sometimes your EBI, or Educational Benchmarking Institute surveys that often Res Life does, If you have a residential campus, you can add 10 questions at the end that are institution specific. So you could add a question into a pre-existing survey. And there are other surveys that allow you to do that as well, but I'm most familiar with the EBI with those additional questions. So those are some options around gathering that information. Or if you're really wanting to direct people to a specific means of reporting, let's say you have a specific website or link or an open report form through your case management program. So you may be wanting to direct people there. Maybe that's a campaign that you work on, either social norming or just informational campaign where you're sharing, hey, here's how you report to Title IX, and you're giving them that information early.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for sharing your question, your example. Other programs or initiatives or things to consider for evaluation or research? Talked about bystander intervention and Title IX reporting. Other things people are looking at? I'll share that something we're looking at is our hazing prevention options. Many of us probably are doing that work. We've recently created a training online using an online training creator that we're then loading into Blackboard. And so we'll have a Blackboard training that all faculty, staff, and students can access. And we need to do quite a bit of evaluation on that for making this mandatory training. So our students, to earlier points, do they know how to report? Do they know some of the consequences related to our code of conduct and our hazing policy, anti-hazing policy? Do they know support measures? Do they understand what our medical amnesty policy means and our Good Samaritan policy means? So we need to do a lot of evaluative work there. And Carrie's posted a good question related to our hazing prevention work. Where does your institution need to identify gaps in prevention? That would be a great area for evaluation and potentially research. I know an area we're really looking at as well, to Carrie's question around hazing prevention work, is we get some pushback from some of our student groups or student involvements that already have requirements around hazing prevention. So athletics, fraternity and sorority life. So they already have some requirements. So why then do they also need to participate in our mandatory training? So we get some pushback there. So that we identify as a gap in our prevention. Thinking back to that evaluative model, is the message getting out to folks in a consistent way? And obviously, if folks are participating in different trainings, one through a national organization, one through an athletic conference, and one through the university, is that information the same? Is it equitable? Is it getting out the messages that we're hoping that it does? So that's a gap that we need to look at. Those who are looking to use qualitative inquiry for their recommendation number 1, changing campus culture, what are you considering for evaluation? It's a quiet group today, and that's all right. Next week's part 2 is much more sort of building out the different methods. So we'll look at building out surveys and micro surveys. We'll look at reviewing narratives and doing coding. And we'll look at some really great data options that may be available on your campuses, whether it's Qualtrics or Zotero or just a lot of different technologies can be useful for us, and for any of us who are working in one-person offices can also take some of the burden off of our shoulders and alleviate some of that, especially if we're thinking about the cost-benefit analysis. We can't spend so much time evaluating our work that we don't have time to do our work. But the evaluations and the assessment are important because it can lead to additional support for the work that we're doing. So
Allie, we had a comment come in while you were sharing what to expect next week. I can read it real quick. We are trying to figure out where our student culture of ostracizing people who are perceived as doing harm is coming from, and trying to line that up better with the sense that there's also community value around growth and development and learning to do better. So how do we wind up with these various sorts of ideas?
Great question. So trying to figure out where our student culture of ostracizing people who are perceived as doing harm is coming from. So people are being ostracized if they're perceived as doing harm, and then trying to line that up with the sense that there's also community value around growth and development and learning to do better. So absolutely. So this idea of maybe some tenets of justice connected here and some restorative practices. So if you're wanting to engage in sort of these 6 questions, what do we want to know? We want to know where this culture is coming from, and how do we maybe instill this community value around growth and development? How do you want to gather that information? Are you looking to survey or focus group? Maybe question 6 comes earlier here. What information are you starting with? So where does this information of the culture of ostracizing people come from? Where are those information pieces starting? I'm not sure if you have that as data or as observation or anecdotal. What ostracizing looks like. How do people who are experiencing that being ostracized, how are people experiencing that? What does that look like? Are they being excluded from leadership opportunities? Are they being left out of social situations? Are they having an impact on academics, on grades, on retention, on persistence? Who should be involved? So folks who have been ostracized, folks who are wanting to make a difference and change this culture, leadership, students, faculty, staff. What do those groups look like? What are the barriers to accessing what you want to know? One barrier could be clarification that folks understand this as a common experience, which may be absolutely very understood at your institution as a common experience, as a phenomena to evaluate or to look into. But if folks don't have clarity on that, wanting to provide clarity, knowing who to get information from may be a barrier for someone who has been ostracized or harmed or left out. They may be less willing to engage in research or evaluation. Understanding where the community value around growth and development and learning to do better comes from. Is that a shared value? Is that a social norm at your institution? Or is that something the institution is trying to push as a social norm? Because those could be perceived differently. Is the information sensitive or controlled? It could be around people's experience. This is something I would definitely encourage chatting with IRB about, depending on how questions are being answered. Is there a pre-existing survey or assessment that's already happening that gets at some of these issues? If you have any assessments through ASCA, the Association for Student Conduct Administrators, they may have some questions already developed around this, again, around restorative practices. And I'm sort of reading into this, and I may not be hitting right on the mark of what you're looking to get at. But I think this would be a really, really fascinating thing to research and to evaluate. If you have a specific program, an orientation perhaps that instills these values, that connects everyone kind of at the same starting place at the start of the year or start of the semester. If you have a university creed or university values that are shared out, that could be a place to start. Finding out if the culture of ostracizing is a new phenomena or something that has been going on for a while. There could be some interesting pre and post COVID looks. I know we're certainly seeing a lot of differences between engagement pre and post COVID at our institution, what leadership looks like and means to folks, what engagement looks like, what experiences students are wanting as part of their college tenure. So great big question. Thank you. I'm going to share my contact information here, and I'll go back to the earlier slide in just a moment, but just want to make sure folks are able to contact me if they want to, and do a little promotion for part 2 from Qualitative Inquiry, Methods, Practice, and Program Evaluation, which is next Monday, same time. Then all my contact information is there. But if folks are thinking about other areas that they can evaluate or consider for research, I want to be here and talk some of those things out with you. Again, we'll get more into the skill-based practice next week. I will remain here for the next at least 9 minutes if folks have other things they want to talk about. Or if folks who have posted in the chat want to unmute and engage in more conversation, happy to do that too.
I'm going to jump in really quick and just say thank you to you, Allie, for your presentation today and for prompting us with these questions that really can help us map out maybe better. We were thinking about it, but what are we thinking about? How do we do this? And also just remind everybody, of course, now my house phone rings, remind everybody that there is the part 2, and that registration link, if you haven't already registered for it, is in the chat room. So please feel free to register if you haven't already. Pass it along to someone else at your institution to request a copy of this recording. All you have to do is email me directly and I will send it to you. But I want to say thank you real quick. And now